If young people don't feel like empowered agents of change, if they aren't supported to step up and take action, then we have a pretty scary situation on our hands.
You're listening to Climate Curious, a podcast for people who care about the world but find the current conversation about climate change confusing, boring, or scary. Hello.
Hello, Ben.
How are you?
I'm good. Still feeling good. Still feeling optimistic.
Still feeling good. Still feeling great. I have a question for you this week, which is, have you ever been on a 30 before 30 list?
Oh, no, I haven't. You know, I was... Wow, what a question, Ben.
Why did you look so distressed?
I have not been on a 30 before 30 list. I'm now many years past being eligible for a 30 under 30 list. And I have to say...
It's horrible, isn't it?
Well, I mean, I missed all of them. The 20 under 20, the 21 under 21, you know, all of those lists. Somewhere out there's got to be like a 40 under 40. But I'll tell you something. I was really wrapped up with it when I was younger, because these lists would come out and I would know everyone on them.
Yeah.
And then I wouldn't be on them and I would feel really... I have to say, honestly, I think I would sometimes feel a bit down on myself, but I've kind of changed my perspective on that now. Now I know it's better to be the one making the lists than the one on the lists.
Well, that is a power move if ever I've heard of one before. I definitely feel that. Like, I've just hit 30 and it's the weirdest feeling ever to like loads of people I know are on them, and it really frustrates me that I never made it.
Yeah.
I feel like such a failure internally, but also I'm going to make the list. I feel like you've just inspired me with such a great soundbite.
It's interesting that you started talking about this, because I was going to ask you, given our guest this week, about when you first remembered caring about something in the world and then doing something about it.
Oh, that's such a hard question. It must have been in my... Well, it's a weird one because I grew up in church, so I feel like I grew up doing stuff that I felt like I was meant to care about all the time. But I think probably the first time that I did something off of my own back was probably the first time I volunteered in my 20s, like for a charity. I was probably about 24, 25 when I made a decision that there was something, I think it was something around race, and I was like, this is like, I need to actually do something about this. And I went and volunteered for a charity that was doing like mentoring stuff with black kids. When was yours? That's such an intense question.
So I like the way that you divided it. So, because my first memory of life is being in a protest when I was like 3.5. Oh,
really?
Yeah. But obviously I didn't go there on my own. So
I decided that I was going to put my boots on and go.
Yeah, no, so I like this idea of the first time, the distinction of the things that you did with your family and versus the things you did with yourself. And for me, it was probably like when I was maybe 9 or 10 and saving up so I could adopt a tiger. Through one of these, you know, environmental conservation things when I was really young, because I love tigers. I love big cats. I still do. But I think activism has definitely been in my life since I can remember conversations in my household. You know, I come from a family of activists. I do think what's interesting now is that we have so many tools that we didn't have back then. And so I love seeing kind of younger and younger people getting involved in it. And this is why I wanted to ask you about this question, because, you know, our guest this week is a 21-year-old climate activist. And
wow.
I know, and she'll probably correct me, but I think she's been doing this for almost a decade, if not longer.
Wow.
So that is a long time at 21 to be doing this. So I'm excited to talk to her about her activism and for us to explore that together. But should I tell you a bit about her?
Yeah.
Okay. So Clover Hogan is 21. She's a climate activist. She is a researcher in eco-anxiety, which we'll definitely talk about. And she works with this really wide range of people. So she'll work with like young people in schools. She'll work with CEOs and big companies. You'll see her speaking at like big global climate conferences, but then also doing lots and lots of work in classrooms with students. And so I am quite excited to get that diversity of perspectives from her. She's also going to be speaking at TEDxLondon Women.
Ow.
That's coming up in February, which I will shamelessly do a plug for later, but we'll come back to that. So should we get started, Ben?
Yes, of course we shall.
Great. Hi, Clover.
Hello.
Hi, guys.
Welcome.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
Thank you so much for coming. I'm so excited to talk to you. I feel like this is one of the episodes where I'm going to get to ask all of the questions that I really, really want to ask. That sounds really intimidating. Ben. Okay, good. Woo! I'm so excited.
Don't hold back.
So, Clover, I know a little bit about you, and I think knowing a bit about your background and what you've done has really helped me understand kind of your perspective. So I'm wondering if you'll share that with everyone listening as well and tell us a bit about how you got here.
Yeah, for sure. So I grew up in Australia's tropical North Queensland, fishing frogs out of the toilet and dodging snakes that hung from the ceiling. So for me, nature was never an other. It was kind of the cornerstone of my experience. And that meant from day one, I was kind of this little nature warrior. Now, I wasn't allowed to watch horror films growing up, so instead I turned to documentaries. I watched An Inconvenient Truth, I watched The Cove, and it was like having the rug pulled out from beneath me. On the one hand, I realized that, I was being raised to love nature, and yet I realized that, everything that I cared for so deeply was under enormous threat. And I think the thing that stunned me the most wasn't so much the extent of this kind of destruction and exploitation, but just how good the adults in my life were pretending that it wasn't happening. And so, we didn't learn about it in school. We didn't learn about it from the politicians. We didn't learn about it from media. And so from a really early age, about 11, I became fascinated with the issues, but I also became fascinated by our responses to them. Within a couple of years, I'd coerced my parents into actually leaving Australia so that I could go to school in the jungle in Indonesia at a place called the Green School, which is wallless bamboo classrooms in the middle of the jungle. And instead of asking young people to pursue careers they have no love for, it really asks young people, what problem do you want to solve? What problem do you want to be your legacy statement, which is quite a big question for a teenager. And for me, it was always, how to be a voice for the voiceless, how to protect these, ecosystems and natural environments that were under immense threat. And my activism throughout those kind of formative years was very much connected at the grassroots. So community building, community mobilization, filmmaking, documentary production, all that good stuff. But at 16, I found myself at COP21, which is the global kind of meeting on climate, where all of these heads of state, politicians, climate scientists fly in to say, okay, what are we actually going to do about this on a global level? And it was my first time kind of being in the seat of power, my first time being in the heart of where decisions were made. And it was the first time I felt incredibly powerless. I'd experienced frustration and grief and anxiety around these issues. And yet for the first time, I was experiencing vested interests. For the first time, I was experiencing greenwashing. I went to something called the Sustainable Innovation Forum, sponsored by Coca-Cola and BMW. And I went in with this kind of wide-eyed optimism about the change that we'd be able to create. And I left feeling so incredibly dejected. And so it was at that point that I decided that I wanted to commit myself to understanding this powerlessness and understanding how we could really mobilize mindsets, because clearly, solutions on technology weren't working. These big global meetings weren't working. And so I wanted to understand what needed to happen on a kind of subterranean level to get people to a point where they actually felt empowered to create change. And so out of that, Force of Nature was born. And now really our mission is to support young people around the world to step up rather than shut down in the face of climate change.
That has got to be one of the most movie scene storylines of a person's life that I've ever heard in real life. That is ridiculous. So hold on, let's go back, because there were loads of things in there. Firstly, you said greenwashing, and I don't know what you're talking about. What is greenwashing?
Yeah, excellent question. So greenwashing is basically when a company pretends to do the right thing while behind the scenes is really doing terrible things for the planet and the environment. And so you see that when lots of companies make these big kind of audacious commitments and promises that they never actually follow up on. And you also see it in a very simple way through the products that you buy. So a lot of companies kind of like hide behind certain labels, sustainable, natural, local, whatever that is, healthy, but there's no accountability. There's no actual system in place to say, what does that actually mean?
Okay, cool. So what was school like?
It was awesome. I think, some things were less great, like the compost toilets.
Yeah.
There's no way to sugarcoat it. Like they're pretty horrible. But generally, I think, I really took the green school for granted. But then I decided that I wanted to go to public high school in France for 6 months in senior year. And it was the worst experience of my life. Like within a couple months, I was basically ready to drop out, because the contrast of going to a place like green school where you're best mates with your teachers and you love what you're learning, to suddenly being in an environment where you're kind of treated like sheep being, ushered through a factory. It gave me two very different windows into what education can look like. And after that experience, I left realizing that green school was kind of the education model of the future. And when I was there, it was still very much seen as kind of like hippy dippy school in the jungle. And yet last year, the World Economic Forum came out with a report on education and said that green school is the model for the future. So I think more and more people are waking up to the fact that lots of young people go through the current education system and leave it feeling really stupid because they've never had a chance to actually understand where they're smartest or understand what drives them or what problems they want to take on. Whereas that's really green school's mandate. It isn't about how you measure up against an IQ test. It's how can you actually think critically about solving these big, complex challenges.
But does that feel like, because obviously I'm trying really hard to not be patronizing and keep bringing up the fact that you're young, but you are 21, right? And if I think back to myself when I was 21, like that would have felt like an immense amount of pressure for me to like prove myself in the world. Does it feel like that for you, or does it just feel like second nature to you now?
It's a really good question. I think it's easy to become like a caricature of yourself. And that's definitely something I reflected on recently, because so much of my identity has been defined by being an environmental activist, being in this movement from such an early age that I'm like, actually, who was I before I started? And does that actually matter? And how does that translate to who I am now and how I show up? And one of the things that I've become conscious of as a kind of messenger and campaigner is that so much of my message is around this real kind of optimism and the world that's possible, and how climate change, the flip side of it is that it's this great opportunity. And yet sometimes that just feels so disingenuous, because how I really feel is despairing about the future and overwhelmed and powerless. And so I've had to do a bit of a sense check with myself to make sure that I am actually like speaking my truth, and that it doesn't feel like this inconsistent kind of like mental gymnastics that I'm having to perform as an ambassador or as the face of something. So it's definitely something that I'm trying to reconcile each day.
But that's so cool. That's also so and I think what you say about speaking your truth is really important. And I guess as somebody who has a vested interest in the topic and the conversation, and also has loads of knowledge and experience in the field, like what you feel must be really nuanced.
But I do feel as well that like I really don't think about my age that often, because I think when you're working on climate, it's like a very sobering timeline. Like from a really early age, I've kind of been told that we have this like ticking time window to take action. And so for me, you know, going to university was never something that I really ever thought, you know, considered.
Wow. Yeah.
Because I was like, actually, I just need to get on with it. Like, I can't spend 4 years going and learning. Like, I just need to be out there getting shit done.
There's so much you said in there. A couple of things I want to pull out, which I think are really important, interesting, and things I want us to delve into. So first is this idea of the powerlessness you felt at that moment when you were 16 at COP21. And I'm curious to know where that led you and where and how that ties into where you are now. But there's something else you said that I wonder if we can explore, is this idea that do we expect young climate activists or climate activists in general to either be like total eternal optimists or just be bringing the doom and gloom? And how do you have that nuance? And how do you, because that's the thing about climate that I've learned, is that it is nuanced. Like you have to be able to hold two very competing thoughts in your mind at the same time. And how did you get there? Like, how did you go from that powerless feeling at 16 to where you are now?
I'm going to try and answer all of those in rapid succession, but let me know if I miss anything. So first up, you know, after I became aware of this, you know, feeling of powerlessness, I was in class at Green School one day, and my environmental studies teacher mentioned this word, ecophobia, that had been coined by a bunch of wacky psychologists back in the 80s. And I looked it up, and sure enough, it said the feeling of powerlessness in response to environmental catastrophe. And I was like, oh, damn, that's what I was feeling. And there's actually an area of research into this thing. And the more and more I looked around, I realized just how pervasive this was. And I realized a little while later that climate denial was its own manifestation of that feeling of powerlessness. But it obviously shows up in lots of different ways in lots of different people. But as I was graduating at Green School, you know, we have to do this thing called a greenstone, which is kind of like a thesis paper. And so I wrote mine on ecophobia. And that was my first time kind of public speaking and presenting my findings. And I was like, here are the 3 reasons why I think we feel powerless. And back then, it was very much a focus on kind of evolutionary psychology. So, you know, why it's really tricky to respond to a threat like climate change when it is so nebulous and so large and so slow moving. You know, the fact that as humans, we have this kind of optimism bias where we always think that, you know, someone's going to prevail or that someone will save the day. Or even, you know, what's called loss aversion, you know, the fact that we're more afraid of losing things in the short term than we are in the long. All of these factors make it really, really difficult and mean that, you know, from the get-go, we're finding it difficult to take action on climate change. And yet, the more and more I kind of worked in the wider world, so from that point at Green School, I worked at Impossible Foods in Silicon Valley, the company that makes meat from plants. I worked with business leaders as a sustainability consultant. I kept seeing this powerlessness show up in more subtle kind of nuanced ways, and especially in the kind of stories that we were subscribing to as a culture, and also as individuals. So I would work with, you know, young people in the classroom, kind of volunteering, who would say, you know, I'm not smart enough or experienced enough, or, you know, I'm just 1 in 7.8 billion people. What can I do really? Or I would work with business leaders who would say, oh, but technology will save the day. You know, robots will have an answer. And I was like, isn't it interesting that in the ravine between wanting to make a difference and taking action live all of these stories that limit our ability to actually show up, whether that is putting the responsibility on some institution or some business, or it is undermining yourself, saying, I could never do what the expert does. I became completely absorbed and fascinated by this particular idea. And so from that point, did a lot more research. And now at Force of Nature, we conduct online classrooms every single week with young people around the world, from Nicaragua to Jakarta, Tel Aviv to New York City, understanding their emotional and psychological responses. And the thing that has defined much of our work is eco-anxiety. So eco-anxiety you can think of as a kind of close cousin to ecophobia. And it relates to feelings of grief, overwhelm, anger, frustration toward climate change and climate inaction. And what the research is now showing is that there is this kind of silent epidemic of mental health problems in young people caused by climate change and ecological breakdown. So Friends of the Earth conducted research last year showing that over 70% of 18 to 24-year-olds surveyed in the UK identified as having eco-anxiety. And the same is reflected in our research at Force of Nature, where over 70% of our international students say, yep, climate change negatively contributes to my mental health, and I experience hopelessness when I think about it. Wow. And so there is this huge problem that we're not really talking about that is beginning to emerge into the wider lexicon, but that's only really happened in the past couple of years. And it's quite incredible to see the contrast now researching this versus when I was 16. And much of the work that we do at Force of Nature is actually working with teachers and educators who are saying, I'm trying to teach about these issues, but young people are showing up with suicidal tendencies and depression and panic attacks because they can't deal with it, they can't handle it. And so we're actually supporting them to be able to talk about climate change in a way that ignites agency rather than that kind of crippling anxiety.
So, Clover, you mentioned in there some of the ways that eco-anxiety is manifesting with mental health with young people. Are there other ways that we're seeing this in the classroom? Like, I'm just curious to know whether this is impacting the way that young people that you're working with are thinking about their futures, for example. It must have a massive impact.
Yeah, so when I ask my parents about the future they envisioned as kids, it's one of flying cars and deadly diseases being eradicated. And when I ask 8 and 9-year-olds in the classroom to describe the future they envision, the world they're inheriting, it's something out of a dystopian Hollywood blockbuster. So I have 8 and 9-year-olds describing empty supermarket shelves, cities underwater, a planet in decline, and the kind of place no one really wants to grow up in. And so eco-anxiety at the extreme end is showing up in this kind of nihilism and despair toward the future. And that's a pretty scary thought, because these are young people who are emerging into the world in the context of, economic meltdown and no jobs and a pandemic and also climate change. And the fact that within our lifetimes, we've inherited these huge problems and our lives have kind of been defined by these catastrophes, whether that's, 9/11 at the start of our lives or the 2008 global financial crash. And now we're being told that systems we've had no part in creating mean that we have just 10 years to completely change every part of how we live, or else we're going to be inheriting the apocalypse. That's a lot to take on. And a lot of young people, because of that despair toward the future, are not even able to future plan, or if they are, it's pretty sad. I've had 13, 14-year-old girls say, I've already decided that I don't want to have kids. Who would I be to bring kids into a world like this? Kids saying, I'm not going to go to university. What's the point? So it doesn't bode well for us equipping this next generation of leaders. If young people don't feel like empowered agents of change, if they aren't supported to step up and take action, then we have a pretty scary situation on our hands.
I mean, that's heartbreaking, right? If you can't feel that naive optimism when you're young, when can you feel it? So that's terrifying. I guess the other thing to think that what you're saying makes me think of is there's definitely this paradox, because on one hand, older people look at young people and see, look how engaged they are. They're gonna save us. Like, they're amazing. And yet what I'm hearing from you is that young people are engaged and they might play a significant role in helping, change the trajectory of the future, but they're not doing it from a place of like hopeful abandon. They're doing it from a place of being terrified. And that's a totally different equation.
Yeah, and there's a huge generational divide that you've touched on. Back to the difference between the world my, parents imagine and the world young people are describing today. Like, my dad, we have lots of political differences and difference in belief, but, he was out there with his long silver hair and skinny jeans protesting the Vietnam War back in the 60s. But it was for global love and peace and this vision of what was possible. And there was so much, wild abandon and hope. And yet in young people today, it's like they're trying to outrun disaster, basically. And a lot of young people have found a lot of, solace in kind of coming together in community and in communal protest, that kind of thing. And yet I think COVID especially has heightened that eco-anxiety because they no longer even have that outlet. They're kind of isolated and alone in a lot of their grief and frustration toward the issues.
Because the other thing here is that, and I'm wondering if this is something you've experienced, is young people being told that they're just, they just need to get a thicker skin and grow up and stop being snowflakes. Like, we've all had to deal with this, like, threat. Why can't you? And I'm curious, like, I don't think that way. I don't know, Ben, if you do, but I'm sure there will be people listening who will think, look, you don't need to feel like so melodramatic about it. What,
Yeah.
you know what I mean? We can imagine those people in our lives who are like, oh, come on, like, really? Like, we've all had to deal with this.
It's not that serious.
Like, Clover, what do you have to say to that attitude?
Yeah, so I start by saying, when we think and talk about eco-anxiety, it's easy to assume that it's a bad thing, right? That it's a weakness. And yet, eco-anxiety is not a clinical condition. And in fact, many climate psychologists would argue that it's the perfectly natural human response. In fact, they would say that the problem isn't that lots of young people are feeling eco-anxiety, but that more older generations aren't. And eco-anxiety suggests a high level of empathy, and it suggests that you are not numbing yourself to the state of the world and to the problems.
Right.
Obviously, we can't constantly be consumed by grief and fear and overwhelm. And yet we have to create space for those feelings because those feelings are what catalyze us to take action. Like, if you reflect on a time when you've taken action on behalf of someone else, or because you really believed in something, chances are that was because you experienced some injustice personally, or you experienced injustice on behalf of another person, and you said, actually, you know what, that's not the status quo, or at least it shouldn't be. That's not okay. It ignited that kind of fire in your belly. And so as a society, we've gotten so good at numbing ourselves to the state of the world, pretending everything's okay, scrolling more, buying more, distracting ourselves from the issues. And yet folks feeling eco-anxiety are able to actually look at the state of the world. And eco-anxiety, as it's currently talked about, is obviously often through a bubble of climate privilege, right? Lots of young people responding to an anticipated threat. And yet you could use the same definition to describe what indigenous tribes have been going through for decades.
Right.
Frontline communities who've watched their homes, be destroyed before their very eyes. And the depression and anxiety that has ensued. There's a quote from an article I was reading recently from an Inuit elder saying, we are the people of the sea ice. What happens when there's no more sea ice? These are folks who are experiencing the loss of culture and land and identity. And so waking ourselves up to the reality of the feelings that are inevitable is a really healthy way of holding tension. And you touched on that earlier, Maryam. Whether you kind of need to be blindly optimistic or naively optimistic or kind of blindly despairing. And I think it's a matter of, holding tension between the two. I've seen that divide in, younger folks versus older generations and some of the business leaders I've worked with. Lots of young people feel so overwhelmed by these feelings. And do not have a kind of outlet of agency, a clear sense of here's what I can do. When you just have the feelings without a sense of here's what I can channel them into, that's when it tips into the powerlessness. That's when it tips into I'm too small to make a difference. Yeah, if you have a clear sense of here's the problem that I want to take on, kind of unattached from expectation or outcome of that problem actually being solved, that's where you really find your power. And for the older generations, often their powerlessness shows up in that kind of denial of, technology will save the day, or, young people will step up to the challenge, right? And so they need to get more in touch with their feelings. They need to create more space for that eco-anxiety and stop treating it as a weakness and start thinking of it as actually this is what's going to catalyze me to step up rather than shut down.
So almost like this, the feeling of eco-anxiety isn't necessarily a bad thing, or good or bad is a value judgment, right? But like it's not something to run away from. It should be an impetus for change. Yeah,
and it's kind of inevitable. Like I think for a long time, I mean, we touched on this at the start of the pod, Ben, where I was saying that I had started to feel like a caricature of myself, constantly being like very optimistic and hopeful and like peddling that message. And yet that all came crashing down in November of last year when I started spontaneously crying. Maryam knows this story, but I was crying in the shower. I was crying on the way to work. I was crying literally in the tube, much to the horror of stoic British society.
Yeah, don't do that on the train.
And I wasn't experiencing, heartbreak from a boyfriend, but I was experiencing heartbreak of some kind, which was in response to the headlines that were rolling in from back home. So in November of last year, Australia was engulfed in flames, and I watched as friends tried to rescue their homes to no avail. I watched as 1 billion animals were incinerated in the fires. I watched as like the very place that had forged me into this passionate environmentalist was incinerated, and I knew that it was never going to be the same. And I kept trying to make sense of the situation and say that I was okay, and my body was like physiologically responding. It was going through this grieving process that I didn't want to happen, and so I had to acknowledge those feelings. Simultaneously, while the fires were raging, 100,000 people were displaced in Jakarta from the flooding, my second home. And so as climate change becomes more of a living reality, we have to get in touch with those feelings. It's not healthy to keep submerging them and to keep pretending that everything's okay. So we need to normalize the, creating space for these emotions and normalize this idea, as you said, Ben, that, there is no such thing really as a bad feeling or a good feeling. It's just about learning how to become emotionally adept and resilient enough that you can navigate it without completely losing your marbles.
And that's, wow, you're so wise. What the hell? Sorry. So this idea of, like, I want to come back to this idea of agency, right, which you touched on before, because I think that that's a really important conversation. And I think what's wrapped up in that for me is like, if we're talking about eco-anxiety, and that's something that's unavoidable, it's something we're going to feel, particularly as the reality of the situation becomes more clear and more personal for us as individuals, what then does agency look like? What does agency and power look like for you now in terms of not feeling powerless, but feeling like you've got something that you can do in the world? How does that manifest?
I think for me, it's like, and I don't mean this to sound like savior complexy, but it is like being in service to something bigger. I think if I focus exclusively on climate change and how it makes me feel, and I don't then channel that into, okay, how can I actually use these feelings for something good? Then it's easy to kind of get sucked into that vortex. And so everything that we do at Force of Nature is around how to support other young people to actually navigate these feelings. We also work with leaders around the world from big companies, Procter & Gamble, Unilever, PepsiCo, supporting their leadership to reconcile their own emotions and their own personal feelings about these issues and turn them into action. We find that the most effective way to do that is actually to serve as a kind of forum for intergenerational exchange. In terms of igniting your own agency, how we do that at Force of Nature is bringing awareness to our own stories that we subscribe to that either serve us or don't serve us. So I'd invite anyone listening to this to really reflect on, what's the story that I subscribe to about the world or about my role in it that keeps me from taking action, whether it is being, not being smart enough or experienced enough, or it is the belief that the system is too broken. And then begin to think about how you need to challenge that story, not in something that's like outside of your control, like, oh, well, if this politician did X, Y, Z, or if this business did blah, but like, what do I need to do within myself to realize that that is in fact a story and that I can shape my own story? But to have impact, you must have focus. So get clear on which problem you yourself as an individual want to solve, and then think about how you can show up to solve that problem according to all the unique skills and talents and passions that you carry within yourself.
And I think what you're saying, Clover, is so important because we can get so paralyzed at that first step, about feeling more. Feeling more seems like such an important moment, and yet it can be such a paralyzing moment. So knowing that the next place you go to after you have that re-engagement with your feelings is to a place of narrowing down of it. It really complements what Krista Mayer was saying a few weeks back about, looking at what you do and what you do well and the change you want to bring about and seeing how they overlap and using that as your conduit rather than trying to fix everything, which is just a path to madness and disappointment. And I think real burnout, actually.
Yeah.
So I love that you've given us a bit of a framework to think about it, but also speaking to you, Clover, the other thing that I've really started to think about is how we can, by thinking that we're empowering young people, we can actually be burdening them. By saying that young people are the solution and that they are the ones who are going to fix it all, that's actually not an empowering statement. That can actually feel like much more of a burden, and I had never thought about that until listening to you.
For a long time, as a raving environmentalist, I thought that people in power were selfish and greedy and were somehow different. And yet I realized that I could not have been more wrong. And for a long time, I felt that people just didn't care. And I've since realized that people are not empowered to care. And so whoever you are, whichever your sphere of influence, it's about being empowered to care. And I think on a personal level, often we conflate fault with responsibility. Climate change is actually not anyone's fault, at least not any one individual. And yet it is the responsibility of each and every person living on this planet to protect the things that matter, to ensure that we deliver a beautiful, thriving planet for future generations, to ensure that at the heart of every environmental climate conversation is a conversation of social justice and racial injustice. Because if we do not protect our communities, if we do not deliver fair, equitable societies, we will never deliver on any of our climate goals. And so each and every one of us has to say, okay, I haven't created this huge, overwhelming challenge, and yet I have a responsibility, and in fact, I have a role to play.
That was such a nice way of putting that. Nice is the wrong word. That was such a powerful way of putting that.
We could have like a standing ovation on a podcast.
Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. I think
Soon, Ben, soon.
That leads us really nicely into one of the last questions I want to ask, which is earlier you spoke about or alluded to this idea of timelines, which was I think a really important point again, and growing up and your experience of growing up being told that there's a specific limit, amount of time before it's irreversible or before everything goes wrong. And so my question to you is, if everything in the next 10 years goes right, what does that world look like?
So I'm going to challenge your question a little bit, Ben, because I've chosen to ignore some of those timelines. I feel that often they aren't helpful, because what happens if in 10 years' time we haven't met all of those climate targets? Does that mean that we throw the towel in? Does that mean we're done? We, dust our hands and walk away? I think the reality is that it already is too late. It's too late for the first mammals to go extinct because of climate change. It's too late for my friends back home who lost their homes to the fires. It's too late for the indigenous communities who have been under attack for decades. It's too late for the environmentalists who are killed every single day for their activism. It's too late for a lot of people in a lot of communities. On a climate level, we're already locked into a certain level of warming that is going to mean huge change, huge disruption. You know, by current projections, we're going to have 1 billion climate migrants by 2050, 1 billion people on the move, right? And so in many ways it is too late. And yet in every other way, we still have everything to fight for and everything to champion. And so I think our power lies in actually relinquishing attachment to some of those timelines and attachment to some of those expectations and outcomes, and just knowing that we need to throw absolutely everything that we have into today and into the present moment.
That was a good answer. You did screw my question up.
This has been an excellent conversation, and I will say, I think, probably one of our more heavy ones, which I think we need. So thank you for delving into that with us and giving us a path out. I want to end on our little fun, lighter segment, Climate Confessions. You know what it's about. I think the listeners by this point know what it's about. If you don't know what it's about, go back to listen to episode 1.
And now, it's time for our Climate Confessions. Let's fess up to the bad habits we just can't kick.
I always make Ben start, but I'll start this week with a confession.
Thanks.
And I think this is particularly funny, Clover, given that you worked at Impossible Foods. So I'm a terrible meat eater, because I don't really like flesh, but I will still eat it. And so I love these new vegan burgers that are out because they just make me feel a bit less gross about the meat. And so the vegan burgers, I don't know if you had the new imitation, the great imitator at Nando's, all that kind of stuff. It's all delicious. And yet every time I order it with cheese. Real cheese, not vegan cheese. That is my confession.
Savagery.
Absolute
savagery.
I have nothing more to say about it. Clover, how about you?
Great confession, Maryam. So I think you can take the girl out of the tropics, but you can't take the tropics out of the girl. And I'm an absolute sucker for coconut water. And so to this day, I will buy my 2-liter plastic bottle of coconut water that has been shipped from Thailand and probably harvested by slave monkeys.
Oh, no.
Slave monkeys are not real. Are they?
Slave monkeys are definitely real.
I didn't know if that was a joke when you said that, or if that was a serious thing. I was like, this is terrible.
Wait, what? Clever, like,
No,
30
slave monkeys.
Chloe, you've got to stop ordering this coconut. This is terrible.
30 seconds on slave monkeys, please.
You'd be surprised by how many of the world's coconuts are actually harvested by slave monkeys. So monkeys that are kept in captivity, worked to the bone, crazy hours, having to harvest these coconuts so that I can have my coconut water living in London when it's 10 degrees outside.
Well, you've just ruined it for me as well now. Brilliant. Thanks for that confession. That was great.
I've never been more thankful that I don't like coconut water in my life.
Oh, man. What is this? I'm trying to name brands of my favourite brand of coconut water, but I don't even want to know. Don't worry. Okay, I'll do some Googling. I'll do some research. That's so bad.
That dwarfs
mine.
all
Oh,
of our...
no. What's mine today? Okay, my climate confession this week is that I think I'm probably like quite a cold-blooded person. So I feel cold really badly. I also really love baths, which means that when I have a bath, I run the bath till it's hot to the point that I can't get in it. Then I wait for it to cool down and I get into the bath, and then I run more water into the bath to heat it back up to the temperature that's comfortable, or like that feels like I'm really warm. But it's a bit of a double jeopardy here, because then I feel disgusting having sat in a bath of my own filth. So I let the bath water out and then I have a shower to clean myself from the bath. But baths are a form of self-care, which is how I justify it for myself. So maybe let's not talk about it anymore.
Baths are
I'm going to stop doing that.
Baths are horrific.
I'm going to stop doing that, because that
So long
does
as you're
feel
not
particularly
bathing in
bad.
coconut water, then you're fine. But
I didn't want to say anything about it, but now that you bring it up, no.
Oh, Clover, thank you so much for spending this time with us, for talking us through all of this. I feel like we could talk about this for another 3 days, and maybe we'll have you back. Before we end, I want to do a shameless plug for these two amazing individuals that you've been hearing on the podcast.
Plug.
So I mentioned at the top of the show that the next TEDxLondon event is TEDxLondon Women. Is taking place on the 6th of February. Because of this global pandemic, we won't be in person, but we will be broadcasting live from the iconic Abbey Road studios here in London, which means you get to experience a whole TEDx event, but in your pajamas at home. And we've got some cool stuff for you. But of course, the highlight of that are our amazing speakers. And you have just spent the last, 45 minutes listening to two of them chat. So if you want to hear more from Clover, if you want to hear more from Ben, go to women.tedxlondon.com, get your tickets. They start from just £10. And if I do say so myself, they make excellent holiday gifts. And tune in on the 6th of February and we'll continue this amazing chat. So thank you, Clover. Thank you, Ben.
Thank you so much.
thank you so much for having me.
I guess everyone will see you in February then.
Stay curious. Thanks for joining us this week. If you enjoyed what you listened to today, please rate and subscribe and share the episode with a curious friend. Join the conversation on socials using the hashtag ClimateCuriousPod and let us know what you want to hear about next time. You can find us online at TEDxLondon.
This podcast was made possible by TEDx London's headline partner, City. City is all about progress and supporting great ideas. And for the past 5 years, they've supported us to bring world-changing ideas to the TEDx London stage. Now they're taking it to the next level by supporting this new podcast. Thanks, City. This episode was produced by Josie Coulter, curation and research by Tara Cooper, engineered and mixed by Ben Beheshti, artwork designed by Sabrina Russo and Rebecca Mingus, music composed by Ben the Falcon Beheshti, presented by Maryam Pasha and Ben Hurst.
Stay curious.